Wait a minute, are saunas bad now too? I can't keep up with this shit. Let's get to the stories. Unbreakable. The story I'm about to tell you dates back to my biohacking times. I was completely convinced, head to toe, that I could turn myself into a superhuman. I wasn't going to sit down and just wait for evolution to come. Oh no, I was going to make it happen. Nothing could stop me back then until I just went too far and experimentation took its toll on my body. I mean, I'd gone through some nasty side effects and unexpected reactions, but all of that was nothing compared to what I'm about to tell you. I was addicted back then to the whole Huberman lifestyle and was doing hot saunas and cold plunges daily. I know what you're thinking, but I was convinced I could activate the brown fat next to my organs. I would improve my body's resistance and elevate my temperature a degree or two above the rest. I had been a high-performance athlete during my college years, so I was very used to suffering to conquer something. I had to endure non-stop training hours before I could break each of my marks running on the track. That was a lot of sweat and pain, but I was the fastest in my class. It felt great. That morning, I filled my bathtub with ice cubes and put some rocks to heat inside my homemade sauna in my backyard. Yes, I wasn't a millionaire then, and I'm not one now. So everything I did was 100% DIY and taken from free sources. I thought I was smarter than the rest, so I didn't need a fancy diploma on my wall to be one step ahead. Well, let me tell you that the people who saved my life sure had one or two of those on their walls. But back to that morning, I was going to take it further than I had ever taken it before. I was going to do two 2-minute immersions with a 1-minute pause. Going for a 4-minute immersion in a single day meant breaking my own record. So I undressed when the water was cold enough and left my smartwatch out to go in. For the first 2 minutes, everything was as usual. I got out of the water, shivering but pumped, and counted to 60 before going inside again. I was feeling dizzy, not super dizzy, but something close to having a misty brain and rubber-like extremities. That was the moment I should have realized something was not right and stayed out of the tub. But somehow that iron-like work ethic I carried from college was stronger than my common sense or even my survival instincts. The moment the water was almost covering my head, I became agitated. I was having problems breathing. I tried to grab the sides of the tub so I could get up and leave the room, but I fell inside again. It was too slippery for me. I tried again to get up and managed to put my right arm out and, using my elbow, raise my body slightly. From there, I could put my other arm over the top of the tub. Finally, using the strength of my right leg, I rolled off the tub and fell to the floor. I couldn't see straight and my body was not responding. I knew what I had to do, but felt my brain's commands weren't being followed. I knew I had to make a fast move or I was gone. I gathered all my strength and somehow managed to grab my smartwatch and send a message to my neighbor. It simply said, "Dying, come please." I think I passed out right after doing that. That's my last memory. When I woke up, everything was white around me. I was completely alone, naked, and in bed. There was nobody around me, but it looked like I was inside of a hospital. I remember thinking, I'm not dead, and crying my heart out. That was the closest I'd been to death. I felt reborn. Sometime that same day, a doctor came to my room and told me a few things about what happened. My neighbor, who luckily for me was going to med school, kept me alive while the paramedics made it to the scene. I was going through an acute panic attack and almost had a stroke. Millie, my neighbor, saved my life. They checked me into the hospital and after regularizing my pulse, ran a few tests. It turns out I had high levels of troponin in my blood. The doctor explained that that's the name of the protein that our body releases into our bloodstream when we're going through a heart attack. When he asked me what I was doing at the time, I said I was doing the Huberman routine and his face changed completely. I was the second person he had seen so close to death because of the biohacking craze that same week. It turns out that contact with extremely cold water increases the troponin levels. How come I didn't read about it before? I should know stuff like that. I remember thinking and for a minute went back to believing they were making that up conspiracy theory style. Some days later, I went to the library in med school, looked it up, and the doctor was right. Troponin really increases with cold water, and it can take a patient close to a heart attack even being as healthy as I was. As soon as I got back, I tore down the sauna and the bathtub and built a gym and a small vegetable patch in the same area. I also stopped consuming anything related to biohacking. In a sense, after surviving that morning, I felt like a superhuman, as if I was unbreakable, just like in my college years. But believe me, and mark my words, I'm not thinking about testing those boundaries ever again. The big office on the 11th floor. Becoming an executive at the firm was very hard. It took years of careful planning, hard work, and a complete overlook of my physical health. Back then, Huberman and Rogan were my mentors. Well, my virtual mentors. Mine and millions of other listeners' mentors, I guess. But to be honest with you, I always thought they were talking directly to me. I guess I want to share this story with you because it took a lot of therapy to get out of that hole. I had to leave my life behind. Although it seems it was a previous life cycle, this wasn't so long ago. I had my big office on the 11th floor in a dedicated parking spot. I also had a full window that overlooked the river. I had one of those offices you only see in the movies, 2 secretaries and an advisor. But this whole thing goes back a little further when I entered that office for the first time as a simple lawyer. I knew I was very good. I just needed to be better. That office had to be mine. That's when it all started. Then, recently, I heard biohacking somewhere and I was haunted by the meaning. I went all in. At first, it wasn't so hard. I was taking 3 or 4 pills every day. You know, the basic stuff. I had managed to balance my body chemically only by watching YouTube videos, TED Talks, and listening to podcasts. I thought I had the whole thing figured out. Boy, was I wrong. About 3 years into biohacking, I was already on 53 pills a day and a couple of electronic monitors in my body. But that wasn't all. I was going into these water-only fasting days, which I was told worked great for cell regeneration. Can you imagine a top executive like me wearing a $10,000 suit, completely wired from the supplements, starving, and working like a maniac for the 18th hour of the day? Well, that was a very close version of me back then. I just couldn't see myself in the mirror. I mean, I would look at myself, but not see myself. I remember my mind being sharper than ever before in my life, but I also have blurry memories of the whole thing. All I can recall is a mixture of alarms sounding, pills taking, never-ending working marathons, and a whole lot of enthusiasm. The problem was me taking it all too far, like always. Well, in a way, I was already taking it all too far by taking 53 pills a day. But that time I accidentally mixed 2 drugs you're never supposed to mix. I might have been too wired or too exhausted and just made a mistake, or I might have done it on purpose to work through the night. I can't recall. I went home that day and sat with my laptop in my office to work through the night. We had to prepare the documents for a big merger. I knew the merger was part of a plan for a bigger, more ambitious process that included a much bigger merger between this new company and a large multinational corporation. I was the only one with that information. If I could finish the paperwork and the planning 1 week before the scheduled time, I could maybe be the first in line when they needed someone to work on the bigger merge operation. I had to take the shot. I didn't want anybody else involved or knowing about it. I wanted to do it all by myself so I could take full credit. I worked through the night and went to work the next day. I thought I was going to have a full night of beautiful sleep after the second day. Wasn't the case. I just sat down to work and worked through the night again and went to the office the third day. It was a bit like a constant deja vu. I could feel I was awake and moving and doing stuff, but I just felt I was 10 inches away from reality. I also remember being angry at everyone and everything. It was as if rage poured out of me with every word. I put on a $20,000 suit and went to work anyway. My chauffeur told me I looked kind of pale, but I didn't pay any attention to him. What does he know? I'm a top exec. I don't take advice from a driver, I remember thinking. I walked into the elevator and people looked at me with alarmed faces. Their eyebrows would go up and they would make this awkward smile at me. I had my headphones on, but was boiling with anger, ready to get into a fight with each of them. I walked out of the elevator and the whole world around me was moving. I had a water-only day ahead of me. I thought that was great because that way I wouldn't feel sleepy throughout my working hours from eating too much. I never did anyway, but just in case. I dragged through the day hiding in my office most of the time. Time was stretching and compressing, and all I did was take pills. I wasn't at all productive. Things were definitely wrong. That night, I turned off all alarms, closed the blinds, and didn't touch the laptop. A good night of sleep would reset my abilities, and I would be a new man by the next day. Sadly, though, despite my efforts, that didn't happen. I couldn't sleep that night either. I went to work in the morning of the next day. That was the 4th in a row with no sleep. I was late with my work in the office and late with my plan to get the full merger deal. I sat at my big, fancy executive chair, turned around, and just looked at the world outside my window. My eyes were injected with blood. My mind was misty. The world was hazy. My body felt numb. Beneath all of that, though, I was profoundly irritated. I had been for the past 2 days. I fought people in my building, inside the elevator, and everywhere else. I just had a very short fuse, and anything could make me explode. That morning, as I looked outside, that anger turned into paranoia. I began thinking about who could get good sleep. I was overlooking the entire city thinking that they surely had pathetic, silly lives but could close their eyes and rest. I couldn't. So I felt poorer than them and my life became sillier than anyone else's. My whole self-image came crumbling down and I went down with it. I ran out of the office into the hallway through the glass in an act of desperation after hiding under my desk for 45 minutes. I cut myself severely and had to be hospitalized. Doctors realized I'd broken my body's chemical balance and I had to go through a cold turkey phase and then a hefty recovery process. For a moment, I thought I was lost for good, but I came back. Well, not exactly back to where I was. My life changed a lot. I transformed the fancy suits into a beautiful house by the beach. I'm never going back to the city again. The red button. When I started, there wasn't a word in the dictionary to describe what I was doing. Now I know I'm a biohacker, but back then I was just going into an adventure. Although in my case it turned out to be something closer to a nightmare than a fulfilled dream, the idea is still something I find fascinating. Well, just like any bad habit or an addiction, I guess. It's awesome, but it almost killed me. But back to the story, my first connection to biohacking, and especially grinding, wasn't my own. I was just a kid. This was the early 90s. My dad used to work for a computer company and there wasn't any tech news he would miss. That morning, I followed him to the veterinarian with Hush, our dog. He was going to get a microchip implanted into him so he would never get lost. I remember him looking at me and saying, "It's like a nameplate, only 1,000,000 times better." I was there through the whole thing, although it only lasted about half an hour. Our dog came out walking happily and almost didn't feel any pain. We lost and found that dog plenty of times with the Avid identification system. The idea was that the chip could store all of Hush's information as well as ours, so any qualified person with a chip scanner could bring the dog back to us. Years went by and Hush passed away, but the idea of having a chip under the skin stuck with me. As I grew older, I took a robotics major in university and eventually graduated with honors. It was my dad's broadest smile ever. We had this improvised lab in the garage. The cars were rusting outside under weather inclemency while we worked inside. It felt amazing. But we were not near to being biohackers. It was a robotics and computer lab. We would build things like a robotic arm for my mom to reach the highest shelves. We also had an automatic dog feeder with a whistle and all. I could name you 1,000 inventions, but that's not the point of this story. The point in this story is me taking this a little further, and a little further, and a little further. The first thing I did was get an NFC chip implant, of course. I went to an underground place. Remember it very well. The place looked like an occupied house. Yet, they had all the needed stuff to avoid any kind of infection, and the whole procedure was over in less than an hour. It was hurtful, the needle was huge, but it unlocked my phone. It was heaven, pure nerdy heaven. After that, I melted my Tesla's ignition card, took out the microchip with the antenna, and installed it in my left forearm. I could start the car and open it up without my keys. By this point, though, my family wasn't at all supportive. My dad used to say, "There's not enough data to say it is innocuous." But I would disregard his sayings because, well, he was getting old and so was his sense of adventure. I remember moving out of my parents' house right after a big fight. I was going to get some headphone implants so I wouldn't have to take them anywhere and could listen to music whenever I wanted. The next one was the chip to open my house's door that went under my skin in my right hand. I could go and get back and never think about keys again. But it all changed when I heard about the Circadia, a motherboard implanted in a biohacker's arm that could read and store his temperature levels throughout the day. Although it seemed awfully painful, it's the size of a small card deck. I thought I could potentially reduce any risks of a stroke or glucose peaks. That could significantly extend my life. Well, it turned out that I was quite wrong, and it almost killed me. I was competent enough with robotics and computers to create my own version of the Circadia. Mine would read all kinds of stuff in my body like glucose levels, heat, and even the oxygen in my blood. But that's not all. It was all going to be backed up by my computer connecting via Bluetooth. I was going to know more about my body than any other living thing on this planet. But the nightmare started once I finished the motherboard I was to implant inside my arm. I couldn't get a doctor to do it, so I started trying with extreme piercing artists without any luck either. I contacted everyone I knew in the biohacking world. I admit it wasn't too many people, but all of them refused to do it. So I decided to do it myself. I was going to install the motherboard inside my arm, and that was final. If nobody was willing to do it, I would do it. I remember clearly that it was a Thursday night. I had everything ready. I'd read every piece of information on incisions and antiseptics I could find, and I was ready. Well, maybe a little scared, but very willing nonetheless. I had to detach the skin from the fatty tissue and slide the motherboard before closing it with some stitches. I used ice to numb the body where the incision was to be made. I used a scalpel and opened it up. The pain was tolerable, but blood was pouring out of the wound, making a big mess. I had to pull the skin up with my other hand, which caused more bleeding. I was starting to feel dizzy. My vision became kind of blurry, and the whole thing became like a movie. It was like watching myself from outside my body. My fingers became rubbery, and I started seeing all these tiny lights that were the signal I was about to pass out. I decided to abort the mission, but it was already too late for that. Blood kept on pouring from my wound. In an act of panic, I dropped the motherboard, and it exploded as it hit the floor. 2 years of work shattered in 2 seconds. My dad and I had an internal code, a red button installed in each other's house that could be triggered, and it would alert the other of extreme danger. I'd never used it before, but it saved my life. Well, paramedics did, but the button alerted my dad, who rescued me in a matter of minutes. Now, I look at the scar on my arm and still think it would have been amazing to always track my body's data, but I know I must wait until science and medicine get that far. That's why I enrolled in med school and am on my way to changing the world as a doctor.